In 1946, a German woman named Maria Reiche packed a suitcase and moved into a small wooden hut in the middle of one of the driest deserts on Earth. She was 43 years old. She had a mathematics degree from the Technical University of Dresden and the ability to speak 5 languages, and she had left Germany 14 years earlier to work as a governess in Peru. And somewhere along the way she had seen something from an airplane window that she could not stop thinking about. Lines, enormous lines etched into the desert floor, stretching for miles in every direction, and between the lines enormous figures of animals and birds and shapes that made no sense from the ground, but from the air looked like something a very large and very deliberate hand had drawn. And Reich had decided that she was going to figure out what they were. So she moved into the desert alone with a broom and a measuring tape and a notebook, and she started cleaning the sand off the lines one section at a time and measuring them and mapping them. And she paid guards out of her own pocket to keep people away from the drawings, and the local people of Nazca initially thought she was completely mad, and maybe she was. But the lines were real, and the lines are a history that deserves to be remembered. Good evening, and welcome back to History for Sleep. I am an absolute history enthusiast, and I am just as fascinated by the blank spaces and the unsolved anomalies of our past as you are. Usually we look at documented events, but tonight we are stepping into one of those blank spaces, into a different kind of mystery. But before we go there, as always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Also, if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let your shoulders soften and your jaw unclench. Let your breathing slow down. Let your mind wander through the mysterious corridors of history. Let's begin. To understand the Nazca lines, you first have to understand where they are, because the location is not incidental. The Nazca Desert sits on a high plateau in southern Peru, about 250 miles south of Lima, between the Andes Mountains to the east and the Pacific Ocean to the west, and it is one of the driest places on Earth. The region receives less than half an inch of rain per year, and in some years it receives none at all. And the wind that blows across the plateau is steady and consistent, and it has been blowing in the same direction for thousands of years. And what that combination of no rain and steady wind means in practical terms is that the surface of the desert does not change. Not in 100 years, not in 1,000 years, not in 2,000 years. The Nazca people, who created the lines between approximately 200 BC and 650 AD, were scraping away the dark reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles that covered the desert floor to expose the lighter yellowish-gray soil beneath. And once those pebbles were removed and piled along the edges of the lines, there was nothing to put them back and nothing to cover the lighter soil, and so the lines they made are still there exactly as they left them, and they will still be there in another 2,000 years if nobody drives a truck over them. And somebody did drive a truck over them. In 2018, a truck driver ignored multiple warning signs and drove across the Nazca Pampa and damaged 3 of the geoglyphs. The Peruvian Ministry of Culture prosecuted him, and the damage was described by archaeologist Johnny Isla, who serves as Peru's chief archaeologist for the Nazca lines, as significant and probably irreversible. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The first people to see the lines from the air were Peruvian commercial pilots in the late 1920s. Their reports of strange markings in the desert floor attracted some attention, but not much. And a Peruvian archaeologist named Toribio Maria Reiche became the first researcher to formally describe the lines in a 1927 paper. But Maria Reiche had only seen them from the ground, and from the ground the lines are almost impossible to understand, because from the ground a line that stretches for miles looks like nothing more than a cleared path in the dirt, and the animal figures, which can be hundreds of meters across, are completely invisible from ground level. And here is something that stops most people when they first hear it. The hummingbird figure at Nazca is 93 meters long, 93 meters, and from the ground you are standing inside it and you cannot see it. Maria Reiche saw lines. He did not see a hummingbird. Paul Kosak was a professor of history and government at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York, and in 1939 he came to Peru to study ancient irrigation systems because he was interested in how pre-Columbian cultures had managed water in a desert environment. And one afternoon in June 1941, he was in a small plane flying over the Nazca Plateau, and he noticed that the lines below him converged at a specific point. And he checked his calendar, and he checked his compass, and he realized that the point where the lines converged aligned exactly with the setting sun on the day of the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. June 21st, the shortest day of the year. Kosak landed the plane and told his assistant Maria Reiche what he had seen. And Reiche, who had a mathematics degree and had spent years thinking about the lines, told him that she did not think it was a coincidence. Kosak called the Nazca Pampa the largest astronomy book in the world, and that phrase stuck. And that interpretation shaped the study of the Nazca lines for the next 30 years. Now stop for a second. Because before we go any further, you need to know who Maria Reiche actually was. Reiche was born on May 15, 1903, in Dresden in the German Empire, and she studied mathematics and geography and pedagogy at the Technical University of Dresden. And she was 29 years old when she left Germany in 1932 with a mathematics degree and the ability to speak 5 languages, and went to Peru to work as a governess for the children of the German consul in Cusco. Cusco, not Lima, not Nazca. Cusco, which is in the Andes Mountains, 400 kilometers from the Nazca Desert, and as far from the lines as you could be while still being in Peru. But Reiche moved to Lima and started working as a translator, and she met Kosak at a seminar and agreed to translate his English paper on the Nazca lines into Spanish. And that translation job changed everything. In 1941, Kosak took her on the flight over the lines, and Reiche saw them from the air for the first time. And she later told the journalist Toni Morrison in a 1978 interview that when she looked down from the plane, she felt something she had never felt before. And she said it was as if the desert was trying to tell her something. And she said she knew in that moment that she would not be able to leave it alone. She was not wrong, but here is where the story takes a turn that nobody predicted. Because Kosak left, In 1948, Paul Kosok finished his fieldwork in Peru and went back to Brooklyn and Long Island University and his irrigation systems research, and he left Maria Reiche alone with the lines. And Reiche, who had no institutional funding and no university position and no official status of any kind, simply stayed. She moved into a small wooden hut near the town of Nazca in 1946, 2 years before Kosok left, and she began the systematic work of cleaning and measuring and mapping the lines and figures that would consume the rest of her life. And the work was not glamorous. Reiche swept the desert with a broom. That is not a metaphor. She literally swept sand off the lines with a broom one section at a time, and then she got down on her hands and knees and measured the cleared sections with a tape measure and recorded the measurements in notebooks. And then she did the mathematics to reconstruct the full shape of the figure she was mapping. The spider figure, which is 46 meters long, took her weeks to fully map. The monkey figure, which is 90 meters across, took her months. And when she had finished mapping the monkey, she discovered that its tail was a perfect spiral, and that the spiral could be traced back to a specific astronomical alignment. And Reiche wrote in her 1949 book, Mystery on the Desert, that the monkey represented the constellation Ursa Major, the Big Dipper, and that the spiral of the monkey's tail pointed to the rising position of the Big Dipper's brightest star at a specific time of year. Mystery on the Desert was published in German and Spanish, and it was the first serious scientific treatment of the Nazca lines, and it established Reiche as the world authority on the subject. The only authority, because nobody else was living in the desert with a broom. And here is a comparison that makes Reiche's situation concrete. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the Nazca Plateau had no tourist infrastructure and no protection, and local farmers drove vehicles across the pampa and cut irrigation channels through the lines without understanding what they were destroying, and cattle wandered across the figures, and Reiche had no legal authority to stop any of it. So she hired guards with her own money. Reiche had very little money because she had no salary and no grants, and survived on the proceeds from selling copies of her book and from occasional donations from people who had read about her work. And she paid local men to patrol the lines and keep vehicles and animals off the figures, and the town of Nazca initially regarded her as an eccentric foreigner who had gone strange in the heat. A 1957 profile in the Lima newspaper La Prensa described Reiche as La Dama de las Líneas, the Lady of the Lines, and said she was regarded in Nazca as a harmless oddity who spent her days measuring rocks in the desert and her nights doing calculations by lamplight in her hut. La Dama de las Líneas, the Lady of the Lines. The name stuck, and Reiche wore it for the rest of her life. And what was she actually finding? Because the astronomical calendar theory that Reiche and Kosok developed was not a vague or impressionistic idea. It was a specific and detailed argument with specific and detailed evidence. Reiche identified what she believed were alignments between the lines and the rising and setting positions of specific stars and constellations at specific times of year. She argued that the animal figures were not just decorative, but were maps of specific star groupings. The spider, she argued, represented the constellation Orion. The hummingbird represented the star Pleiades. The condor represented a section of the southern sky visible from the Nazca Plateau at a specific time of year, and Reiche further argued that the Nazca people had solved complex geometric problems in order to draw the figures at such enormous scale without being able to see the whole figure at once, and she demonstrated that they had used a system of stakes and cords to project small drawings onto the desert floor at large scale, in the same way that an artist uses a grid to scale up a small sketch. And she found the evidence for this system in the field. She found stake holes at key points along the outlines of several figures, and she found cord impressions in the soil that corresponded to the radii of the curved sections of the animal figures, and she published this evidence in a series of papers in the 1950s and 1960s that are still cited in the archaeological literature today. But here is a problem with the astronomical calendar theory, and it is a problem that Reiche herself never fully resolved. The number of confirmed astronomical alignments in the Nazca lines is actually quite small. Gerald Hawkins, who was the astronomer who had famously cracked the astronomical alignments at Stonehenge in England in the 1960s, turned his attention to the Nazca lines in the 1970s and applied the same statistical methods he had used at Stonehenge. He found that the number of alignments between the lines and significant astronomical events was not substantially greater than what you would expect by chance from a large number of randomly oriented lines on a flat surface. Hawkins published his findings in a 1974 paper in Science magazine, and he concluded that the astronomical alignment theory for the Nazca lines was not statistically supported. Reiche rejected Hawkins's conclusion. She said his statistical methods did not account for the precision of the alignments she had measured, and she said the astronomical theory was correct, and she continued to defend it until her passing. But the doubt had been planted, and other researchers were beginning to develop a different explanation. In 1968, a Swiss hotel manager named Erich von Däniken published a book called Chariots of the Gods, and everything changed, not for the better. Von Däniken was born in 1935 in Zofingen, Switzerland, and he had no academic training in archaeology or anthropology or any related field. And at the time he published Chariots of the Gods, he was the manager of the Hotel Rosselin in Gruyères, Switzerland. He had a legal history for financial misconduct that his publishers apparently did not consider relevant to his qualifications as a theorist of ancient civilizations, but the book sold. It sold in numbers that serious archaeologists found difficult to process. Chariots of the Gods sold more than 7 million copies in its first year, and has since sold more than 65 million copies worldwide. It has been translated into more than 30 languages, and it argued, among other things, that the Nazca lines were a landing strip for extraterrestrial spacecraft. The argument went like this: the figures at Nazca are so large that they can only be seen from the air. Therefore, the people who made them intended them to be seen from the air. Therefore, the people who made them were either communicating with beings who could fly or were themselves able to fly. And since the Nazca people had no aircraft, the beings who could fly must have come from somewhere else. Von Däniken wrote in Chariots of the Gods that the Nazca Pampa looks from the air like a model of our present-day airports, and he said the lines are runways and the geometric shapes are parking areas. He said the whole thing was built to guide spacecraft to a landing site in the Peruvian desert 2,000 years ago. Now stop, because Maria Reiche had a specific response to this theory, and it is worth hearing in her own words. Reiche was interviewed by the journalist Alan Brown for a 1977 BBC documentary on the Nazca lines, and Brown asked her directly what she thought of von Däniken's extraterrestrial landing strip theory. Reiche said this. She said the idea is absurd, and she said if you land a spacecraft on gravel at high speed, you do not make neat lines in the surface, you make a crater. And she said the Nazca lines are not craters, they are cleared strips of pebbles. And she said anyone who looks at them carefully for 5 minutes can see that they were made by human hands with simple tools. She said von Däniken has never spent 5 minutes looking at them carefully. The BBC journalist Alan Brown later wrote in a 1978 article in The Guardian that Reiche delivered this assessment without raising her voice and without any particular emotion, and he said she sounded like a mathematics teacher correcting a student who had added 2 and 2 and gotten 5. That description stayed in the literature. Reiche as the mathematics teacher, von Däniken as the student who got 5. But here is the problem. Von Däniken's book had already done its damage, because in the years after Chariots of the Gods was published, the Nazca Plateau became a tourist attraction, and the tourists who came were not the careful researchers who came to study the lines. They were people who had read von Däniken's book and wanted to see the alien landing strip, and they came by the thousands, and they drove vehicles across the pampa, and they walked across the figures, and they left tire tracks and footprints in the desert surface that are still visible today. The Swiss Liechtenstein Foundation, which began surveying the damage to the Nazca lines in the 1990s, published a report in 1997 documenting hundreds of instances of vehicle damage to the geoglyphs, and the report concluded that the damage done to the lines between roughly 1970 and 1990 was greater than any damage done to the site in the previous 2,000 years. Greater than 2,000 years of wind and the occasional earthquake, done in 20 years by tourists with jeeps and motorcycles. And here is something that makes this worse. Reiche had been warning about exactly this kind of damage since the 1950s. She had written to the Peruvian government in 1952 asking for official protection for the lines, and she had been ignored. And she had written again in 1955, and again in 1959, and she had paid her own guards out of her own pocket because the government would not act, and she had continued to pay those guards through the 1960s and into the 1970s as the tourist traffic increased. And then in 1977, Peru finally passed legislation protecting the Nazca lines as a national heritage site. Reiche was 74 years old. She had been asking for that protection for 25 years. A Peruvian journalist named Cesar Hildebrandt wrote in the magazine Carretas in 1978 that the legislation came 30 years too late, and that the Peruvian government owed Maria Reiche a formal apology for ignoring her for a quarter century while tourists drove across the drawings she had spent her life protecting. The government did not issue an apology, but in 1993, the Peruvian government awarded Reiche the Order of the Sun, which is the highest honor the Peruvian state can bestow on a civilian. And Reiche, who was 90 years old and nearly blind by that point, accepted the medal at a ceremony in Lima, and the photograph of her at that ceremony in her white dress with the medal around her neck is one of the most reproduced images in the history of Peruvian archaeology. She passed away 5 years later in 1998 at the age of 95, still in Peru, still near the lines. But here is where the story shifts in a direction that neither Reich nor von Däniken saw coming. Because while Reich was defending the astronomical calendar theory against von Däniken's aliens and the Peruvian government's indifference, a new generation of researchers was quietly developing a completely different explanation for the Nazca lines. And this new explanation was not about stars, and it was not about spacecraft, it was about water. Johann Reinhard is an American anthropologist and National Geographic explorer who began working in the Nazca region in the 1970s. And Reinhard spent years studying the relationship between the lines and the physical geography of the Nazca Plateau, and what he found was a pattern that nobody had looked for before. Reinhard noticed that many of the straight lines at Nazca did not point at anything on the horizon, not a star, not a constellation, not a solstice, sunrise, or sunset. They pointed at mountains. Specifically, they pointed at the mountain peaks in the Andes to the east of the Nazca Plateau. And Reinhard knew from his study of Andean cultures that mountain peaks held a specific and central role in Andean religious practice, because mountain peaks were where the rain clouds gathered and where the water came from. And in an area that received less than half an inch of rain per year, the mountain peaks were not just geographical features, they were gods. Reinhard published his theory in a 1985 book called The Nazca Lines, a new perspective on their origin and meanings, and he argued that the lines were not an astronomical calendar and not an alien landing strip, but a network of sacred pathways leading to sites where rituals were performed to petition the mountain gods for water and for the fertility of crops. Here is the detail that made Reinhard's theory compelling in a way that the astronomical theory never quite managed. The Nazca region has almost no surface water. The rivers that cross the plateau are mostly dry for most of the year, but underneath the plateau there is water. There is a network of underground aquifers fed by rainfall and snowmelt from the Andes. The Nazca people knew about these aquifers because they built a sophisticated system of underground aqueducts called puquios to access them, and the puquios are still functioning today. Some of them are still supplying water to the Nazca Valley 2,000 years after they were built, and Reinhard found that many of the lines at Nazca run parallel to or directly above the underground roots of these aquifers. Not pointing at stars, pointing at water. And then Anthony Aveni arrived. Aveni is the Russell B. Colgate Professor of Astronomy and Anthropology at Colgate University in New York, and he is one of the world's leading experts on archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient cultures used astronomy in their religious and ceremonial practices. Aveni came to Nazca with a specific set of skills because he had spent decades studying astronomical alignments in ancient sites across the Americas, and he knew better than almost anyone how to distinguish a genuine astronomical alignment from a coincidence. And Aveni looked at the Nazca lines and he did not see an astronomical calendar. What Aveni saw when he looked at the lines was something much more specific. Aveni noticed that the straight lines at Nazca often radiated outward from central points that he called ray centers. And he mapped these ray centers across the plateau, and he found that many of them were located near sources of water, near the banks of the dry river beds, or near the locations of the underground puquios. And Avani argued in his 2000 book Between the Lines, The Mystery of the Giant Ground Drawings of Ancient Nazca, Peru, that the race centers were gathering places where groups of people came together for ritual purposes connected to water. Aveni told National Geographic magazine in a 2003 interview that the trapezoids at Nazca, the large rectangular cleared areas, were not parking lots for spacecraft and were not calendar markers for astronomical events. He said they were assembly areas, and he said the trapezoids are big, wide spaces where people can come in and out. And he said the rituals were likely involved with the ancient need to plead for water, in a desert that gets less than half an inch of rain per year. And here is a comparison that makes this concrete. The Hopi people of the American Southwest, who live in one of the driest regions of North America, have a ceremonial tradition called the snake dance, in which participants walk in ritual procession along specific routes that connect their villages to sources of water. And the purpose of the snake dance, according to Hopi ceremonial leaders, is to petition the rain gods for precipitation. And the route of the procession matters as much as the dance itself, because the walking is the prayer. Aveni argued in multiple papers and interviews that the Nazca lines worked the same way. Not images to be seen from the air, pathways to be walked on the ground. And Aveni pointed out something that the alien landing strip theory and even the astronomical calendar theory had consistently overlooked, which is that many of the Nazca figures, when you trace their outlines, are continuous lines with no crossings, meaning you can walk the entire outline of the figure without ever lifting your foot or retracing your steps. The spider, the hummingbird, the monkey, the monko, all of them, from start to finish without retracing. And Aveni argued that this was not a coincidence. He said it was the point. The figures were not art to be viewed from above. They were ceremonial routes to be walked on the ground. But here is a problem with the water ritual theory, and it is the same problem that the astronomical theory had. It cannot be proven. Reinhard and Aveni have compelling evidence and strong arguments, and their theory is supported by the broader context of Andean religious practice in ways that the astronomical theory and the alien theory are not. But there is no written record from the Nazca culture. The Nazca people did not have writing. They left no texts and no inscriptions, and no oral tradition that survived the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the 16th century. And without a written record, every theory about the Nazca lines is ultimately -500 an inference from physical evidence, and the physical evidence is consistent with multiple interpretations. Helen Silverman of the University of Illinois, who spent years excavating the ceremonial center of Kawachi near the Nazca lines, published a 1993 book called Kawachi in the Ancient Nazca World, in which she argued that the lines were connected to the ritual activities at Kawachi, and that the site functioned as a pilgrimage center, and that the lines were processional routes leading to and from the ceremonial complex. And Silverman's interpretation is compatible with Reinhard's water ritual theory and with Aveni's walking pathway theory, and also with some elements of Reich's astronomical theory, because Kawachi's architecture shows alignments with certain astronomical events. Which means the most honest answer is that the Nazca lines were probably not doing one thing. They were probably doing several things at once: water ritual, and astronomical observation, and ceremonial procession, and social organization, and possibly things we have not thought of yet. And that is where the story stood when a Japanese archaeologist named Masato Sakai decided to point a machine at the desert and let it look. In September 2022, a team of archaeologists from Yamagata University in Japan laced up their boots and walked out onto the Nazca Plateau, and they spent the next 6 months walking. Just walking across the desert floor, checking coordinates on GPS devices, and photographing the ground at their feet. And what they were looking for was not visible to the naked eye from standing height. The story of how that list was generated starts in 2004, when Masato Sakai, a professor of anthropology and archaeology at Yamagata University's Institute of Nazca, began a systematic survey of the Nazca Plateau using aerial photography and satellite imagery. And Sakai had been working on the lines for years, and he understood something that many previous researchers had not fully appreciated, which is that the known catalog of Nazca geoglyphs was almost certainly incomplete. Because the survey methods used by Reiche and her contemporaries had a fundamental limitation. Reiche had mapped the lines on foot and from light aircraft, and she had focused on the large figures that were visible from the air, and she had identified around 30 major animal figures and several hundred geometric lines and shapes, and her catalog was the foundation of everything that came after. But Reich's eyes could only see so much, and the Nazca Plateau covers 629 square kilometers. 629 square kilometers of desert to be searched by a woman with a broom and a measuring tape. Sakai told the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in a 2024 paper that when his team began their systematic survey using high-resolution aerial photographs, they immediately started finding figures that Reiche had missed, not because Reiche was careless, but because some of the figures were simply too faint or too small to be identified by the human eye from the heights at which the photographs were taken. And then in 2016, Sakai's team obtained even higher resolution photographs, and the sheer volume of image data they needed to analyze became too large for a human team to process in any reasonable amount of time. Sake contacted IBM Japan, and IBM Japan connected him with the IBM Thomas J. Watson Research Center in Yorktown Heights. And the Watson Center's researchers built an artificial intelligence system trained on deep learning techniques that had been developed originally to identify objects in everyday photographs, and then fine-tune on several hundred known Nazca figures. The system learned what a Nazca geoglyph looked like, not from above at high altitude, but from the subtle contrast patterns in high-resolution drone imagery taken close to the ground. And then they let it look at the entire plateau. And here is what the machine found, and here is why it matters. The AI system identified hundreds of candidate locations where faint soil contrast patterns suggested the presence of previously undocumented geoglyphs, and Sakai's team fed those candidates into their field survey list. And between September 2022 and February 2023, The team walked to each candidate location and verified on the ground what the machine had flagged from the air. The results were published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in September 2024. 303 new geoglyphs confirmed. 303. In 6 months. It had taken human researchers nearly a century to identify the first 430 figurative geoglyphs at Nazca. The AI and Sakai's walking team doubled that number in 6 months. Sakai told the Associated Press in September 2024 that the scale of the discovery had surprised even him, and he said, "We knew there were more figures out there, but we did not expect to find this many." And he said the new figures changed the picture of what the Nazca people were doing on this plateau in a fundamental way. But wait, because the 303 new figures are not just a bigger number. They are a different kind of figure. That difference has serious implications for every theory about the Nazca lines that has been proposed in the past 100 years. The figures that Reiche and her colleagues had documented were mostly large. The hummingbird is 93 meters long. The spider is 46 meters long. The monkey is 90 meters across. These large figures are only fully visible from the air, which is why they generated so many theories about astronomical observation and alien spacecraft and beings who could fly. But the 303 new figures found by Sakai's AI system are mostly small. Many of them are less than 10 meters across, and many of them are visible from the ground. A person standing at the edge of one of the newly discovered figures can see the whole thing without getting into an airplane. And Sakai and his colleagues argued in their PNAS paper that this changes the interpretation of the entire site, because if most of the Nazca geoglyphs are small enough to be seen from the ground, then the theory that the figures were made to be seen from above loses much of its force. The figures were not necessarily made to be looked at from the sky. They may have been made to be walked around on the ground, which is exactly what Aveni had argued in 2000 and exactly what Reinhard had argued in 1985, and the AI did not set out to prove their theory. It just found the evidence that had been lying in the dirt for 2,000 years waiting for something with sharp enough eyes to see it. And here is something that will stop you cold. Among the 303 new figures identified by Sakai's team, there are humanoid figures, not animals, not geometric shapes, human figures. Some of them are depicted in postures that suggest movement or ritual action, and some of them are associated with ceramic fragments and other material remains that can be dated to specific periods of the Nazca culture's history between approximately 200 BC and 650 AD, and the presence of humanoid figures changes what we thought we knew about what the Nazca lines represented, because the dominant interpretation had been that the animal figures represented deities or cosmological symbols, and that the geometric lines were processional routes. But humanoid figures suggest something more immediate and more personal. They suggest people depicting themselves in the landscape, not messages to the gods from below, but images of the people who were doing the messaging. And here is where 3 separate threads of this story come together in a way that nobody planned. The first thread is Reiche's 50 years of work establishing that the lines were made with mathematical precision, using stakes and cords, and that the Nazca people had solved complex geometric problems to project small drawings onto the desert floor at enormous scale. The second thread is Reinhard and Aveni's argument that the lines were connected to water ritual, and that they were made to be walked rather than viewed from above. The third thread is Sakai's AI survey showing that most of the Nazca figures are small enough to be seen from the ground, and that there are far more of them than anyone realized, and that they include humanoid figures suggesting personal or communal ritual activity. And when you put those three threads together, you get something like this. The Nazca people lived in one of the driest places on Earth, and they needed water, and they built underground aqueducts called puquios to find it, and they organized communal rituals to petition the mountain gods for rain. And those rituals involved walking along specific routes on the plateau, and at intervals along those routes they cleared the dark pebbles from the desert surface and drew figures in the lighter soil beneath. Some of the figures were small and personal and were meant to be seen by the people walking past them. Some of the figures were large and cosmological and mapped the relationships between the earth and the sky and the water sources in the mountains. And some of the figures were geometric cleared spaces where groups of people gathered to perform the rituals that they hoped would bring rain to a desert that received less than half an inch of rain per year. Nobody wrote any of this down, because the Nazca people did not have writing, and the only record they left is in the dirt of the plateau, and it has been waiting there for 2,000 years for someone to read it, and the reading is not finished. Sakai told the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2024 that there are still more candidate locations identified by the AI system that have not yet been verified by field surveys, and he estimated that on-the-ground confirmation of all remaining candidates could add another 200 to 300 figures to the catalog, which means the Nazca lines are still growing. And Johnny Ayla, who serves as Peru's chief archaeologist for the Nazca lines, told the Guardian newspaper in October 2024 that the AI survey has fundamentally changed the conservation challenge, because there are now hundreds of newly documented figures that need to be mapped into the protection plan. He said some of the new figures are in areas that were not previously covered by the protection regulations, and that the Peruvian Ministry of Culture is working to extend those regulations to cover the newly discovered sites. He said the lines keep surprising us. He said every time we think we understand the extent of what the Nazca people made, we find out there is more. And here is the final irony of the entire story of the Nazca lines. Von Däniken said the lines could only have been made with the help of beings from another world, and he was wrong about the beings. But he was not wrong that the lines required something extraordinary, because the Nazca people did not have metal tools, and did not have writing, and did not have the wheel. And they lived in one of the harshest environments on Earth, and they spent hundreds of years drawing enormous figures in the desert that they could not fully see from the ground, and they maintained a network of underground aqueducts that are still functioning today, and they organized a society complex enough to coordinate the labor and the ritual and the mathematics required to produce something that a machine with sensors 20 times more sensitive than the human eye is still finding new parts of in 2024. Not aliens, just people. Remarkable people in a remarkable place, doing something that we still do not fully understand, and that is the honest answer. So that is the story of the Nazca lines, a woman with a broom and a measuring tape who moved into a desert alone at the age of 43 and spent 50 years cleaning sand off drawings that had been lying in the dirt for 2,000 years, and a professor from Brooklyn who flew over the plateau on the day of the winter solstice and saw the sun set along a line in the desert and called it the largest astronomy book in the world. A Swiss hotel manager who decided the lines were a landing strip for spacecraft and sold 65 million books and sent tourists with jeeps and motorcycles across the drawings that Reiche had spent her life protecting, and an anthropologist from National Geographic who noticed that the lines pointed at mountains and concluded that they were prayers for rain, and a Japanese archaeologist who pointed a machine at the desert in 2022 and found 303 figures that human eyes had missed for a century. 5 people, 5 different answers, and the lines are still there. And here is what Reiche said near the end of her life. She was interviewed by the Peruvian television journalist Rosa Maria Palacios in 1995, and Reiche was 92 years old and nearly blind, and she was sitting in her small house near the Nazca Plateau. And Palacios asked her if after 50 years of work she felt she had solved the mystery, and Reiche was quiet for a moment, and then she said no. She said, "I have not solved it." She said, "I have described it." And she said, "Describing it took everything I had." And she said, "The solving is for the people who come after me. Describing it took everything I had." That sentence has stayed with researchers who study the Nazca lines ever since, and it is the most honest thing anyone has ever said about them, because that is where the Nazca lines actually stand after 100 years of research. Described, not solved. The plateau is still there. 629 square kilometers of desert in southern Peru, where the dark pebbles meet the lighter soil and where 2,000 years of wind have kept the lines exactly as the Nazca people left them. And somewhere on that plateau, there are still 200 to 300 geoglyph candidates that Sakai's AI system identified, and that no human has yet walked out to verify. And underneath the plateau, the Pucreos are still running. The underground aqueducts that the Nazca people built 2,000 years ago to bring water to a desert that receives less than half an inch of rain per year are still channeling water through the limestone, and some of them are still supplying the Nazca Valley today. The Nazca people are gone, but the water system they built is still working, and the lines they drew are still waiting. And that is enough for tonight. Let the desert settle. Let the lines lie in the dark the way they have been lying for 2,000 years since the last person who understood them walked away. Let your breathing slow down. Let your shoulders drop. The questions will still be there in the morning, and the plateau will still be there, and Masato Sakai's team will still be walking across it, checking coordinates, and the machine will still be looking, and somewhere in the dirt there is an answer that has been waiting for the right pair of eyes. I hope you enjoyed this episode of History for Sleep.